Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Look, understanding how COVID-19 came to be is critical to America's public health. I want to point out and make clear that we wouldn't even be having this hearing in the first place if it wasn't for President Biden taking early and decisive action in May 2021 to investigate whether the novel coronavirus originated in a lab or nature. President Biden directed the intelligence community to conduct this review to, quote, do everything we can to trace the roots of this outbreak that has caused so much pain and death around the world so that we can take every necessary precaution to prevent it from happening again. In fact, the very intelligence that Democrats and Republicans voted to declassify last month was collected because of President Biden's directive for the intelligence community to use every tool at its disposal to investigate COVID-19's origins. Dr. Lowenthal, can I get a quick yes or no? Was President Biden's directive a critical step in advancing our understanding of the pandemic's origins?
Yes.
I agree. And thanks to this action, we're making progress every day in advancing our understanding of the pandemic's origins, despite continued obstruction from the Chinese Communist Party. And while we know more now than we ever did before, the fact of the matter is that the intelligence community's assessment remains inconclusive on whether the virus emerged from either human contact with an animal or from a laboratory accident. Various elements of the intelligence community have made different assessments, all but one of which were made with low confidence, meaning without certainty. Dr. Lowenthal, you have explained that the function of intelligence is to reduce uncertainty. When intelligence on a particular issue is divided between two conclusions, what is the best course of action for policymakers? Should we prepare in the event of both scenarios?
Probably, but policymakers can make their own decisions regardless of the intelligence you give them. We are not speaking ex cathedra. We're giving their best intelligence, and then they are making decisions. But if you had two strong possibilities, and I were a policymaker, which I've only done once or twice in my career, I would say, yes, you should try to protect against both of them.
I agree with this, too. And this is exactly the approach that President Biden and Democrats have taken, an approach that puts people over politics. While our intelligence community continues to collect and analyze information that will bring us closer to a definitive conclusion, we have worked to prevent and better prepare for the next deadly pandemic so that we can keep the American people safe, no matter if this threat originates from an animal or a lab. In fact, last Congress, Democrats included in the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2023 significant reforms to address pandemic preparedness. This includes provisions to enhance safety standards for biomedical research involving pathogens of pandemic potential and to recruit more public health workers with epidemiological backgrounds. It also includes reforms to prevent undue foreign influence in our nation's biomedical research, such as the requirement that participation in foreign talent programs be disclosed to receive NIH grants, and a provision directing the Secretary of Health and Human Services and national security officials to identify and develop strategies that address threats to sensitive biomedical research. There's a whole host of other common sense reforms that we passed last Congress as part of this package that are outlined on this fact sheet. Mr. Chairman, permission to enter it into the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. And you know, I find it interesting that despite how much my colleagues on the other side of this dais have focused their efforts to push a lab leak narrative, they voted against these reforms that help prevent lab leaks in the future. I also want to point out the good work the administration is doing by partnering with our allies to press for strong international standards for biosafety and security as part of its national security strategy. And while these are all good steps forward, I do think that there's more we should do and can do. Dr. Lowenthal, what additional steps should we be taking from an intelligence and policy perspective to build on this work and to better prepare us for future pandemics?
Well, I outlined those in my opening statement, Mr. Ruiz, but one of the things you have to remember about the intelligence community is we are a volunteer organization. I cannot draft doctors any more than the military can draft individuals. And so when we go out looking for people, looking for experts, we have to hope they want to come work for us. But we obviously have gaps. The National Military Intelligence Center is there, but they are mostly been devoted to supporting the defense establishment, which is fine. I'm suggesting we need broader expertise than that. But you have to remember, we can only recruit the people who come to the recruiting table. This is one of the great frustrations of my life in my last 3 years at CIA. But we have to look at our expertise across the community, and we have a system for doing that, and ask ourselves, where are the gaps, and then how do I go hire the people to fill in those gaps?
Dr. Lowenthal, I received my medical doctorate at Harvard Medical School. I received my master's in public policy from Harvard's Kennedy School. And I realized that when I was at the Kennedy School, the CIA was there recruiting students to join their firm. Yet there was no recruitment happening in the public health school, which I later received a master's in public health from Harvard School of Public Health, or from the Harvard Medical School. So perhaps one of the suggestions would be to entertain the career options for public health and physicians and medical scientists to join the intelligence communities in doing their research as well.
I think that would be a good idea. There were also no CIA recruiters, and I got my degree from the Harvard History Department. We tend to, we have to rethink how we recruit. So going to medical schools, public health policy schools would be a very good idea.
Thank you. I yield back.
Now recognize the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Comer from Kentucky, for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank each of the witnesses for being here today. As I've said from the beginning, discovering the origins of COVID-19 is vital to both the public health and national security of the United States. Former CDC Director Redfield testified last month that this is not simply a scientific question, but also one of intelligence. And I agree with that. And we need to ensure the intelligence is accurate and truthful. On March 17, 2020, one of the most influential papers of all time was published in the scientific journal Nature Medicine, entitled The Proximal Origin of SARS-CoV-2. It was prompted by Dr. Fauci and written to suppress the lab leak hypothesis. This paper stated that no type of lab-based scenario is possible. Director Ratliff, is that factual?
It is not.
Mr. Feith, to you, is that statement factual?
Based on my understanding, no.
10 days later, on March 26th, the State Department produced a memo that stated U.S. scientists assessed the virus emerged naturally. It continued to say a lab leak was improbable and not supported by the available evidence. Director Ratliff, are those statements factual?
They are not.
Mr. Feith, to you, are those statements factual?
No, they were at best overstated.
Mr. Feith, you were involved in the briefing that produced that memo?
I was a recipient of the briefing that the memo is an account of.
So, while serving at the State Department investigating the origins of COVID-19, were you ever briefed by an author of the Proximal Origin paper?
Yes, sir.
During the preparation of that memo, which I referenced above, do you believe the unnamed scientist had apparent conflicts of interest?
In short, yes, especially based on what we know since then about them.
Were the authors, were they the ones that were briefing the intelligence community, the authors of that?
So that document is a write-up of a so-called analytic exchange that had been hosted by the State Department's Intelligence and Research Bureau that day or the day before, including a number of U.S. scientists who were briefing a range of policymakers from across the interagency.
So that the authors were on the conference call with Dr. Fauci on February 1st, 2020, where they almost universally said COVID-19 may have come from a lab.
That actually I'm not sure of, and there's a little bit of a difficulty in identifying exactly who was part of that State Department briefing just because of the rules that we were subject to.
Okay. Director Ratliff, once you became director, did Dr. Fauci relay any of these concerns to you?
He
that
didn't.
may have come from a lab?
He did not.
Now, why do you think he did not?
Well, that would I would obviously have to speculate, but I would point you to Dr. Fauci being perhaps the best person to answer that, and there is publicly available under information that has been obtained through open sources and freedom of information, where Dr. Fauci and other virologists and scientists talk about the fact that it would bring unwanted attention to funding sources. And the research that was taking place using funding sources, domestic funding sources from the United States, and the relationship of certain Western scientists with scientists at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, where unsafe coronavirus research was taking place in labs that did not have appropriate biosafety levels and precautions, as had been reported.
Oh, this is so bad. It just gets worse every day. These scientists flipped 180 degrees with no new evidence, produced a paper not based on facts, and then may have used that paper to brief the intelligence community and suppress the lab leak hypothesis. This is a how-to manual in orchestrating a cover-up by using some of the most powerful and influential institutions in our country. If you ask me, this was set in motion by Dr. Fauci to hide U.S. funding of gain-of-function research and dodge accountability for a virus that has killed more than 1 million Americans. This must be investigated. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
I now recognize Mr. Mafumbe from Maryland for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you very much, Chair Winstrup, and my thanks also to Ranking Member Ruiz and all others who collaborated to make sure that we could have this hearing today. I want to thank the witnesses for their participation. Mr. Radcliffe, welcome back. Mr. Chairman, the COVID-19 pandemic has underscored in many ways that the Chinese Communist Party's growing influence is absolutely contrary to America's interests and to America's values. If we as a Congress fail to meet this moment, I fear that we will undermine for some time to come our ability to respond to the next public health crisis and to protect American interests both at home and abroad. We've got a long road ahead of us. However, in the last 2 years, congressional Democrats, as the majority party during that time, working with President Biden, did lay the groundwork to make sure that we take decisive action necessary to safeguard and to advance our health, our geopolitical, and our economic interest. In October of last year, the Biden administration announced its national security strategy, which includes, as most of us know, a 3-part plan focused on outcompeting China. And Mr. Chair, I would ask unanimous consent that that national strategy be entered into today's record.
Without objection.
The first step of the plan was to invest in strengthening American competition. President Biden delivered on that, rolling out initiatives guided by the Bipartisan CHIPS and Science Act to strengthen American manufacturing and American supply chains, all, mind you, while solidifying America's technological leadership on the global stage. The State Department also launched, as we know, the China House Initiative, which brings together China experts from throughout the State Department and security officials to help the administration responsibly manage competition between the U.S. and China. The second step of the plan was to work with America's allies with common purpose and with a common sense. President Biden delivered, convening, as we know, the leaders of Egypt, Cambodia, Indonesia, Japan, South Korea, the EU, Italy, the UK, Mexico, and Canada to emphasize that combating China's global influence must be a team effort, to which, by the way, they all concurred. The third and final part of the plan was to put resources to defending America's interests abroad. The president delivered, including in his fiscal 2024 budget proposal to the Congress, comprehensive investments in the Indo-Pacific region's critical infrastructure, as well as investments focusing on shoring up American defenses in that region. Dr. Lowenthal, you're by all counts an expert in intelligence matters and have a robust understanding of China's influence in the global order. I appreciate the recommendation in your written testimony advocating for a national intelligence officer. I appreciate the chair's comments that if in fact there is a similar position in place, that we ought to look at expanding that role. Can you tell this committee, sir, and the American people what you think is the most important tactic that this Congress can use to counter the Chinese Communist Party?
Well, I think it's, excuse me, Mr. Mifune, I'm recovering from a cold. I don't have COVID, I promise you. It's less a tactic than a strategy. We need a strategy for dealing with China, and it's a difficult issue because we are entangled with them economically. They are a competitor. They are a rival. That doesn't mean that they're necessarily an enemy, but we have to figure out how do we outcompete them without resulting in overt hostility. And you have to also remember that anything that we do is going to have a reaction from the Chinese. So when President Biden tries to control the chip industry, for example, so that we're not supplying a rival with the technology that they need, which makes good sense to me. We did the same thing to the Soviet Union during the Cold War very successfully. The Chinese interpret that as an act of hostility, which if we were all sitting in Beijing, we'd probably agree with. It's important, certainly as an intelligence analyst, to understand how the other side is going to react. But I think we need a strategy. And I think we have elements of that strategy. I think the AU, the United States, British, Australian alliance is part of that strategy. I think that's being successful. I think our relationship with India is part of that, is successful. But this is also, we have to be prepared, just as we were during the Cold War. This is a long struggle. This is not going to wrap up in this administration or the next administration. This is a long-term struggle. But I think if you look at it objectively, would you rather be China or the United States? I'd still rather be the United States.
Every day.
Every day.
Every day.
There is
Mr. Lowenthal, Dr. Lowenthal, my time has expired. Mr. Chairman, there's much to be done, obviously. I just want to invite colleagues on both sides of the aisle here and in the larger body to work together in a thoughtful manner to develop national security solutions based on putting the American people first. I yield back. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. I now recognize Ms. Malliotakis from New York for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to the witnesses who are here today. What is equally as important as the CCP's actions to cover up and conceal the origins of COVID is understanding what role our government may have played in the origins of this virus and to what level, if any, that the health officials and members of our media attempted to conceal or hide the truths from the American people. The questions surrounding American tax dollars being used to potentially fund the origins of this virus and attempts to suppress them, that is what I'm here to focus on today. In November of 2021, Dr. Fauci told Senator Rand Paul under oath that the NIH did not fund gain-of-function research at the Wuhan lab, despite having been explicitly told in an email in January of 2021 that NIH had a monetary relationship with the Wuhan Institute through the EcoHealth Alliance. During the committee's initial origins hearing in March, I asked former CDC Director Dr. Redfield whether the NIH was funding or had funded gain-of-function research at the Wuhan Institute, and he told me, direct quote, "No doubt," unquote, NIH was funding this research in Wuhan, refuting Dr. Fauci's claims. I'll start with you, Mr. Ratcliffe. Do you agree with Dr. Redfield?
I do.
Given what we know now, if you were in Dr. Fauci's position, would you have denied that the NIH's role in gain-of-function research at the Wuhan lab?
No.
Do you think that Dr. Fauci lied under oath?
I think that some of Dr. Fauci's testimony is inconsistent with some of the intelligence that we have that remains classified, as well as inconsistent with some information that is publicly available.
Do you think that President Biden should declassify all information related to COVID origins, every single document as was requested and passed by the legislature?
Well, with the caveat that we always have to be careful about protecting our sources and methods, particularly those sources and methods as it relates to what the intelligence community uniformly agrees is our number one threat from a nation-state actor standpoint. But with that caveat, providing as much information about our intelligence as possible while preserving those sources and methods should absolutely take place.
Thank you.
As soon as possible.
Mr. Feith, do you agree with Dr. Redfield's original testimony that this funding, which very well likely played a role in the virus, came from let me back up and fill you guys in. So even more troubling, at the time, when my time was expiring at the last hearing, Dr. Redfield testified that not only did American tax dollars fund gain-of-function research through the NIH, but also from that the Wuhan lab received money from State Department, USAID, and the Department of Defense. Do you agree with Dr. Redfield's testimony that this funding, which very likely played a role in the virus, came from these government agencies?
My understanding is consistent with what you've read back in terms of the many funding sources that ran, from Washington to the Wuhan Institute of Virology, and certainly if the COVID origin is indeed a lab leak from there, it was from bat coronavirus research programs, some of which were funded by the United States government.
Okay, because we had previously heard about the NIH funding, but up until that hearing, I had not heard that it was potentially the State Department, USAID, and the Department of Defense that had also funded Wuhan lab activities. So the U.S. government determined that the Wuhan lab collaborated on publications and special projects, top secret projects, with the CCP military since at least 2017. Knowing this, for what purpose would U.S. Department of Defense funding be provided to the Wuhan lab?
Well, I think for a full answer, I defer to folks from DOD and from the DOD, biodefense, relevant components, but in principle, the kind of broad theme of the funding, as I always understood it, across different parts of our government, NIH and USAID and state and otherwise, was based on a certain theory of pandemic prevention by scooping up these viruses, playing with them in the lab, and then trying to design vaccines and therapies. But there were always warnings that this was extremely dangerous work, and that the work courted exactly the kind of danger that appears to have happened in Wuhan. And from our perspective, at the parts of the State Department that don't specialize in this, part of what was most troubling is that when COVID broke out in Wuhan, practically on the doorsteps of that lab, we did not have folks from other parts of the government raising their hand to educate the experts across the government in how plausible this was and how it needed to be taken seriously. In fact, the folks from the other parts of the government that work these issues generally were deflecting attention, and that cost us a lot of time and understanding that was really damaging.
All right, well, I've run out of time. And Mr. Ratcliffe, you have anything to add to that? Because I saw you nodding your head. If not, I'll defer back to the chairman. Thank you.